So, for the last several years, I've been doing a lot of thinking off and on about if I could pass any constitutional amendment, what would I pass? And what would I do? And what would those look like? Um, and I've come up with about 10 that would be like a second Bill of Rights if I could, assuming I could get them passed, no problem. Now, I thought I'd share them, that you guys think, hear them, give some feedback, things like that. So here's my list of the 10 new amendments I would add if I could do that, you know, and make things happen. So what would those be? Number one would be um, a right to privacy, that all citizens have the right to privacy. But under that, I would include what things are considered private, and I would then codify some of the Supreme Court decisions that are based on the right to privacy, but they wouldn't be exclusion like all inclusive. There would be some wiggle room where you could add things that I didn't think of. So you would have the right to an abortion because it is a private medical decision. Under this thing, it would be listed that you have the right to an abortion up to the point of viability for any reason. Um, and then I would include the right to contraception, the right to have any partner you choose, the right to marry whoever you choose, because those are private decisions. But you have a right to privacy inside, in your own life. That would be the first one. The second one I would include is I would have one saying before the first caucus or primary during an election year, any candidate up for a federal office must release tax returns for the past 10 prior tax years that they were required to file their taxes. Failure to do so should shall disqualify the person from being eligible for whatever race they're trying to do. Now, if they were not required to file, all they have to do is show why they did not file. If they didn't have a job, whatever the case may be, that they did not need to file a tax return, that's fine, but they need to release their taxes. Now, why did I include this one? Well, because there was a lot of discussion about Donald Trump not releasing his taxes, not knowing what his taxes were like going into 2016 and then again in 2020, and just all of the chaos surrounding that discussion about what actually is on those tax returns and the importance there. Because we need to know as voters where the money that the people we are voting for is coming from. So I thought that was a good inclusion. Okay. My third one has to deal with the Supreme Court nomination process. As you may know, when there is a vacancy on the Supreme Court, the president gets to pick that replacement, and the Senate must confirm that replacement choice. Now, what is my amendment? My amendment says the Senate shall have 180 days from the date of nomination of a Supreme Court justice to hold a vote on that nomination. Should that 180-day deadline pass, that nominee would be considered approved if not voted down by the Senate. Now, why did I include that? Well, let me continue. In a presidential election year, the current president then shall not make any Supreme Court justice nominations after May 1st up through the following inauguration. Now, why are those two things on there? Well, you may remember in 2016, Barack Obama appointed Merrick Garland to the bench in February. The Senate sat on that nomination and did not take any action until January of the following year when Donald Trump became president and Donald Trump was able to make the new appointment. And the Senate had said at the time that it was too close to an election year. But then you fast forward to 2020, with weeks to go prior to an election, they pushed another nominee through. So this would just put a cutoff of May 1st through the inauguration, and then, but it would also force the Senate to act, so they couldn't hold up a Supreme Court seat indefinitely, because in theory, as it stands right now, the Senate could take years and years and years to confirm a Supreme Court seat. So that would just keep the Supreme Court functioning. Okay. My fourth one would be some kind of universal health care, some kind of single payer healthcare system. Um, because we need healthcare in this country. Our healthcare costs are outrageous and through the roof. So I would be making some kind of a recommendation to get a single payer universal healthcare system going. Okay, my fifth one would be the minimum wage shall be is required to be reviewed by Congress every 10 years. But then I also said when the minimum wage would increase, all wages are required to increase by the same amount. Now, why did I include those two parts? Well, I think a 10-year look at the minimum wage is sufficient. That means once a decade that the Congress is reviewing the minimum wage to make sure it meets the requirements that it was originally intended to be, which is a wage that is a living wage, and it was originally intended that you could support a family of four off of that minimum wage. So if Congress is reviewing that every 10 years, we can make sure that the minimum wage keeps up with where it needs to be. Now, why did I include the other part? Well, all wages are required to increase by the same amount. Well, it doesn't do any good if the minimum wage goes to $15 and you raise the minimum wage, but you have somebody at a job where they are currently making $16 and they get no increase in their wage. They were worth, in my opinion, using that analogy, of they would have been $8.75 over minimum wage if they were making 16. But then when the minimum wage increases, now they're only worth $1 more. That math doesn't work to me. I think you would need to have a increase across the board to help everybody end up better off. Okay. The sixth one would be gun control. Background checks, red flag laws. Incorporate all of those because you can use an amendment to repeal other amendments. And I'm not saying we need to repeal the Second Amendment. We just need to modify it slightly to make sure the people who should not have guns do not have access to those guns. So that's what I would do that in the form of an amendment, and that's just one of the ones I would do. Okay, my seventh one is a rather long one. This all has to do with the office of the president. Part one would be naturalized citizens with at least 20 consecutive years of citizenship are eligible to run or serve as president. Why did I include it that way? Well, right now, only natural-born citizens, which has been determined to mean people who have their citizenship from birth, are eligible to be president. By adding a 20 consecutive year mark in addition to the other requirements, now you have naturalized citizens who have lived in the country 2 decades and have met the other requirements, including 14 years of residency. Those people would be eligible to serve as president. I just think it's a good way to be more inclusive as to who can run, because you never know who actually could make a very good president but might be excluded because of the place they were born. The second part is presidents do not have immunity for crimes they commit while president. Now that seems pretty self-explanatory, but that was added in my notes after the disastrous Supreme Court decision in which they said presidents are immune for official acts while in office and left it very gray as to what that might imply. My third part in this one is a restriction on who can be president. A convicted felon would be ineligible to run for president. Should a convicted person already be on the ballot, those votes would count as votes for their running mate only, and if that ticket wins the election, the running mate would be considered as having won the presidency, and after they are inaugurated, they would have to then appoint a vice president. And I think that is kind of self-explanatory where my logic and thinking was in that. if you cannot serve in the military because you're a convicted felon, you can't get security clearances normally if you're a convicted felon, and normally you couldn't vote if you were a felon in most jurisdictions. So why can they run for president? I think that is a good thing. And by adding the second clause, it does happen that if somebody were to be convicted of a crime, say after an election or after the nomination process, then their ticket wouldn't be wholly disqualified. The running mate could still potentially win and continue the rest of that term. The fourth part, like I said, this is a very long one. A sitting president can be indicted. If a special counsel can get an indictment from a grand jury, the sitting president can and shall be indicted. They would go through the normal trial process. During that time, using the 25th Amendment, the powers of the president shall transfer to the vice president, and the sitting president who is under indictment will have no powers of the presidency at all. The House can then impeach a president, and the Senate can try a president who has been charged with a crime. So normal impeachment proceedings could happen based on my thoughts here. And then if a president would be convicted during their term, the powers of the president will not be returned unless they are acquitted on appeal. So they could stay president technically until they are removed by Congress, but they would have zero leadership power, and everything would be handled by the vice president. I think that is a very good idea. Presidents are not above the law, and there is a chance a president could commit crimes while in office. And if, like I said, a special counsel could indict somebody, I think they should be held responsible for those crimes. So that's kind of why I've included that. I know it's a little lengthy, but those are my thoughts there. My eighth one here is on the Supreme Court and reforming the Supreme Court. First would be an enforceable code of ethics, a written code of ethics that the Supreme Court would have to follow. Some kind of term limit for the Supreme Court, whatever that term would end up being, whether it is 2 years per justice, and I don't mean 2 years, a 2-year term when they're replaced. I mean, like right now we have 9 justices, whether that would be 2 years each, so 18-year term, and then you're replacing a justice every 2 years. I don't know what that math would look like, but some kind of a term limit. But there should also be some kind of qualifications to be a Supreme Court justice. I think there should be an age requirement, and there should also be a law degree requirement, or at least some amount of time on the bench. Usually that would require a law degree on top of it. So, because as it stands right now, there are no requirements to be a Supreme Court justice other than being confirmed by the Senate. So I do think we need to update that and include some kind of qualifications for the Supreme Court. And lastly, as far as reforming the Supreme Court, I think there should be an increase to the number of justices. I think the number should be set in the Constitution. And what should that number be? Well, right now we have 13 appellate districts. So it would be 13. But I think the number should be equal to the number of districts, or equal to the number of districts plus 1 if there is an even number of appellate districts. Why? Because I think there should always be an odd number of justices on the Supreme Court. It is easier to get a majority when you're dealing with odd numbers. So those are some of the reforms I would put in for the Supreme Court. Again, with my 8th amendment on this list. My 9th one here involves Washington, D.C. As it sits right now, Washington, D.C., while it does have representation in Congress, it is not treated like a state. It does not have representation that can vote. There are members, one member of, I believe, both the Senate and the House for Washington, D.C., who can speak, but they cannot vote. So I would change that. And what I would do is grant a limited special status for D.C. only. And I would grant them the rights of states, but I would not grant them statehood. And I'm it's probably a difference, that doesn't need to be distinguished, but I would not call them a state. I would leave them as a special district, but give them the full rights of a state, including 2 senators and representation based on population. They are more populous than some states already, so I think that is only fair. They should have that level of representation. I just don't like the idea of calling it a state, because you are dealing with something the size of a city. It's a big city. It's about 600,000 people, but it's still one city. So granting it this special status of being its own thing, I think is warranted. Lastly, is one that has been proposed numerous times, and that is a change to how representatives are decided for Congress. Now there was a proposed amendment back in the early days of the United States to do the same thing, and it would have been 1 rep per 100,000 of population. Now, I'm not going that extreme. That would lead to thousands and thousands of members of Congress. But I would change the representation to 1 rep per 750,000 in population. And then you would round up. Round up. So if you're at 750,001 in population, you would have 2 reps in your state, with no upper limit right now or for how many reps there are. Now, with my system, you would have an ever increasing number of representatives in the state, whereas the system we currently have, if population switches, you can have states gain or lose representation in Congress based on their population, as well as the proportional population of other states. When I was young, Iowa had, it was 5 representative districts, and we lost one at some point because our population dropped. With this system, the population would set the caps, and you wouldn't necessarily lose a representative based on where your population is in regards to proportionally the other states. And why 750,000? Well, based on the current population of the United States, that leads me to about the number of representatives we currently have. At rough math, it would make it about the same. So those are just some ideas for some changes to the Constitution I would make if I had the ability. If you have any ideas for better ones, let me know. Drop a line in the comments. I just thought I'd share this with you guys and see if I was onto something. So like I said, just let me know what you think.